The world had changed overnight. A once bustling metropolis had descended into chaos, consumed by an unstoppable virus that turned the living into mindless, flesh-hungry zombies. Cities crumbled, governments fell, and society as they knew it collapsed. The airwaves, once filled with broadcasts of news, music, and conversations, went silent. The emergency broadcasts that once gave hope and direction had ceased, leaving nothing but static in their wake. In a small, isolated community on the outskirts of what used to be a major city, a small group of survivors clung to their last shreds of hope. Emma, the group's de facto leader, had spent the last few days trying to make sense of the world. Her gaze was fixed on the small radio, which had gone silent hours ago. Once a symbol of communication and connection, now it was just a useless piece of metal and wires. Emma glanced around at the others. There was Sam, the tech-savvy college student who had tried to fix the radio countless times. His fingers worked frantically over the device, muttering curses under his breath as if willing the machine to spring back to life. Beside him, Clara sat with her arms wrapped around her knees, her face pale and drawn from days without sleep. She had lost her brother during the early days of the outbreak, and her grief weighed heavily on her heart. Then there was Ben, the quiet ex-soldier who had joined their group after a brutal encounter with the undead. His stern, emotionless expression betrayed nothing, but Emma knew better. Beneath his tough exterior, Ben had seen horrors that no one should have to witness. "Maybe it's time we accept it," Clara spoke softly, breaking the silence. Her voice was hollow, devoid of the hope it once carried. "The world's gone dark. The signal's broken for good." Emma clenched her fists, fighting the urge to argue. She had thought the same thing herself, but she refused to give up. There had to be more out there. Somewhere, there had to be a signal. A message. A sign that the world wasn't entirely lost. "We can't give up," Emma said firmly, standing up. She forced herself to sound more confident than she felt. "I know it's hard. But we need to keep trying. We need to believe that there's hope left out there. The signal will come back, we just have to hold on." Ben didn't say anything. He simply stood up, walked over to the window, and peered outside, scanning the horizon. It was the same bleak scene they had seen for days now. Abandoned cars lined the streets. Broken windows and rubble littered the ground. Not a soul in sight. The undead roamed the streets aimlessly, as they always did, oblivious to the survivors holed up in the small house. "What if it doesn't?" Sam asked, his voice edged with frustration. "What if the world's just over? No one's coming to save us." "Sam, stop." Emma's voice was sharp, a crack of fear seeping through. She didn't want to think about the possibility that Sam might be right. "We don't know that. We just don't know yet." The silence that followed was suffocating. Time seemed to slow as each person wrestled with their own doubts and fears. The world outside was a nightmare they couldn't escape, and every day they spent hiding was one day closer to being consumed by it. "I heard something," Clara said suddenly, her voice tinged with a spark of hope. She looked up at Emma, eyes wide. "I think I heard a transmission." It was faint, but it was there. A message. Something about a safe zone, a place where people are gathering. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She rushed over to Clara, her mind racing. "Where? What did it say?" Clara bit her lip, trying to recall the details. "It was hard to hear. The signal kept cutting out, but I think it was coming from the old military base. It said something about a safe zone for survivors, a place where they're holding out against the undead." "Did you hear a location?" Sam asked, his voice suddenly more animated. He turned to face Clara, his previous frustration replaced by curiosity. "No. Just the base," Clara replied, shaking her head. "But it was enough. It's something to go on." Emma's mind raced as she processed the information. A safe zone. It was the first real lead they'd gotten in weeks. But a military base? The undead were everywhere, how could they possibly make it there alive? "We need to go," Emma said, her decision made. "We need to find that base. It's our only chance. Ben turned from the window, his expression unreadable. We'll have to move fast. We don't know how many of those things are out there. I know, Emma said, her voice steady. But we have to try. We can't just wait around and hope for a miracle. This is our chance. Sam nodded, already gathering supplies. Clara, though hesitant, stood up and moved to help. Emma could see the hesitation in her eyes, but there was something else now, a flicker of hope. The group quickly prepared to leave, knowing the road ahead would be dangerous. But for the first time in days, Emma felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the faintest glimmer of hope. The signal wasn't completely broken. There was a chance. There had to be. With their weapons in hand and their packs secured, they set out into the desolate world, leaving the broken signal behind them in search of a new future. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the wreckage of the world as Emma and her group made their way through the deserted streets. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay, a constant reminder of the world that had fallen apart. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, the only sound accompanying them as they moved cautiously past abandoned vehicles and crumbling buildings. Emma led the group, her senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant creak of metal, made her jump. The fear was always there, an unshakable presence that gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. The zombies could be anywhere, waiting for an unsuspecting soul to wander too close. Keep moving, Ben said, his voice low but steady. He was always the one to remind them of the harsh reality. Stay alert. We don't want to get caught out here. Emma nodded, her eyes scanning their surroundings. She'd been to this part of the city before, but it was different now. The streets once teemed with life, but now they were only a graveyard for forgotten memories. Cars were overturned, store windows smashed, and the few buildings that still stood had been gutted by time and neglect. It was a ghost town, and it felt as though the world itself had forgotten this place. The group moved quickly, avoiding the main roads as much as possible. They cut through alleyways and narrow paths, hoping to stay out of sight of the zombies that roamed in packs. The streets were eerily empty, but they knew that could change at any moment. Zombies were unpredictable, and even a moment of inattention could mean disaster. I don't like this, Clara whispered as she lagged behind. It's too quiet. It's always quiet, Sam replied, his voice barely audible as he fiddled with his backpack. That's the problem. The silence was unsettling, a stark contrast to the constant hum of life that used to fill the city. It was the silence of the dead, a void where there used to be voices, laughter, and the bustle of everyday life. It was as though the world had gone to sleep, and nothing would wake it up again. Ben, who had been walking ahead, suddenly stopped. Emma and the others froze, sensing the tension in the air. Ben's hand went to his rifle, his eyes narrowing as he peered around the corner of a building. The others followed suit, their hands gripping their weapons tightly. What is it? Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben didn't answer immediately. He held up a hand, signaling for silence, and then motioned for them to move closer. Slowly and cautiously, they approached, staying low to the ground. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as they crept toward the corner. She could feel her pulse in her throat, her breath coming in short bursts. As they rounded the corner, the sight that met them was both relieving and terrifying. A group of zombies, perhaps 5 or 6 of them, shuffled aimlessly through the street ahead. Their movements were slow and erratic, but their presence was undeniable. They were a reminder of how quickly the world had changed, how fragile their existence had become. We need to go around, Ben said, his voice low and controlled. Stay quiet and stay out of sight. The group backed away slowly, retracing their steps to find another route. The zombies were oblivious to their presence, but they didn't want to take any chances. A fight with the undead was a fight they didn't want to engage in unless absolutely necessary. Are we sure this is the right way? Sam asked, his voice tinged with doubt. The military base could be miles away. Are we even going to make it? We have to try, Emma replied, her voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at her insides. We've come this far. We can't stop now. They continued their journey, taking care to avoid the zombies and staying as quiet as possible. Every so often, they would stop and listen for any signs of movement, scanning the area for threats. It wasn't long before they reached the outskirts of the city, where the landscape began to change. The buildings grew sparser, and the streets gave way to open fields and dense woods. "Maybe it'll be safer out here," Clara said, her voice barely audible as she gazed out at the horizon. Emma nodded, though her thoughts were clouded with doubt. The open spaces might provide a bit more freedom to move, but they also made them vulnerable. There was nowhere to hide, and if zombies were lurking in the woods, they would have nowhere to run. "We stick together," Emma said, her voice resolute. "We stay close, and we keep moving. The base is out there. We just have to find it." The road ahead was uncertain, and every mile felt like an eternity. But despite the overwhelming fear and the unknown dangers that lay ahead, Emma couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. For the first time in days, the idea of finding the military base, of finding a safe place, seemed within reach. The journey was far from over, and danger lurked around every corner. But Emma and her group had made it this far. They had survived the worst of the outbreak. Now, they had to keep moving forward. The hope of reaching the military base was all that kept them going. They couldn't afford to let it slip away. Part 3: The Unseen Dangers. The landscape around them had changed significantly as they ventured farther from the city. The once bustling streets had given way to empty roads and overgrown fields, where nature had begun to reclaim what humanity had once built. Abandoned cars rusted in the ditches, their windows shattered, their tires long since deflated. The world outside the walls of the city felt abandoned, a forgotten realm where only the dead seemed to roam. Emma, Ben, Clara, and Sam moved cautiously through the wild terrain, their senses sharp. The unsettling silence was the most dangerous part of it all. They could hear the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird, but those noises weren't the danger. The danger was the zombies, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the smallest mistake. "Keep close," Ben whispered, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "The woods are as dangerous as the streets. If we get separated, we're done." Emma nodded, keeping her hand on the hilt of her knife as they continued walking through the dense underbrush. The trees were thick here, casting long shadows on the ground. The sunlight barely broke through the canopy above, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Clara walked next to Emma, her eyes darting nervously from side to side. She hadn't said much since they left the city, lost in her own thoughts. Emma knew how hard it was for Clara, losing her brother, the constant fear of being torn apart by the undead, and the endless days of uncertainty. But Clara was strong. They all were, in their own way. "I don't like this," Clara muttered, breaking the silence between them. "It feels wrong." "I know," Emma replied softly, keeping her voice steady. "But we have to keep going. We're getting closer. We just have to trust that the safe zone is real." "Are you sure it's real?" Clara asked, her tone tinged with doubt. "What if it's just a trap? What if we're walking straight into a disaster?" Emma didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure herself. The radio transmission had been so faint, so fragmented. They had no way of knowing whether it was genuine or just another false hope, like all the others they'd heard before. But they had to keep believing. They had no choice. "We have to believe," Emma said finally, her voice firm. "It's the only chance we have." The group pressed on, their pace quickening as they moved through the forest. They came across a small clearing, and Ben held up a hand to signal them to stop. Emma, Sam, and Clara immediately froze, instinctively looking around. "What is it?" Emma asked, her heart pounding in her chest. "Movement," Ben replied, his voice low. "Stay down." They crouched low, making themselves as small as possible behind a cluster of bushes. The air was tense, thick with the scent of decay. Emma could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she strained to listen. From the edge of the clearing, they saw movement, figures stumbling through the trees. At first, they looked like shadows, but as they came into clearer view, Emma's stomach twisted with dread. They were zombies, their bodies covered in dirt and grime, their eyes vacant and lifeless. The group held their breath, praying they hadn't been noticed. The zombies shuffled aimlessly, their moans low and guttural, like the sounds of a distant storm rolling in. Emma's eyes darted between the undead, watching their every move, hoping they would pass without incident. One of the zombies, however, paused. Its head jerked upward, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. The creature sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. It began to move toward them, its feet dragging across the ground in an uneven, jerky gait. "Stay still," Ben whispered urgently. "Don't make a sound." Emma held her breath, her fingers tightening around her knife. She could hear the zombie's slow approach, its feet dragging across the dirt. She could see its face now, pale, gaunt, and covered in cuts. The stench was unbearable, an overwhelming mixture of death and decay. It was so close, she could almost feel its cold, lifeless breath on her skin. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. But then, just as the zombie reached the edge of their hiding spot, it stopped. Its head jerked to the side, as if distracted by something, an invisible presence or sound from the distance. Without warning, it turned and shuffled away, the rest of the undead following suit. Emma let out a quiet exhale, her muscles aching from the tension. She turned to Ben, who was already gesturing for them to move. "Now," he mouthed. The group moved quickly, as silently as possible, ducking and weaving through the trees. Emma's heart was still pounding in her chest, and every rustle of leaves made her jump. But they couldn't afford to stop now. The military base was still out there, waiting. As they continued through the woods, the group fell into a rhythm. They walked in silence, each one consumed by their own thoughts, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Emma kept her focus ahead, but her mind wandered. What would they find when they reached the military base? Was it truly safe, or was it just another broken promise? They were so close now, so close to something that could be the end of their journey, or the beginning of a new nightmare. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. Not now. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly, but finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they reached the edge of the forest. Ahead, Emma could see the faint outline of a fence, a barbed wire perimeter, and the silhouette of what might be the military base. Her pulse quickened. They had made it this far. Now they had to see what waited on the other side. Part 4, The Broken Gate. The edge of the forest opened into a vast, barren expanse. Before them stood a tall, rusted fence, its wire jagged and twisted like a monstrous spider's web. Beyond the fence loomed a collection of abandoned buildings, tall structures with broken windows and doors that hung loosely on their hinges. It was the military base, but it was nothing like Emma had imagined. It looked as though time and neglect had taken their toll. The once pristine complex now appeared more like a ghost town. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the base, and the silence that enveloped it was thick with the weight of years of abandonment. Emma's heart thudded in her chest, the hope she had clung to now tempered by an overwhelming sense of dread. The military had been their last hope. But now, standing before this broken, forgotten outpost, Emma couldn't help but wonder if they had been too late. "Is this it?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible as she squinted at the darkened buildings. Emma nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "It has to be." Ben crouched by the fence, his fingers tracing the rusted metal. "The gate's broken," he muttered. "It's been a while since anyone's been here." A shiver ran down Emma's spine. She couldn't shake the thought that they had walked into an abandoned trap. The silence felt oppressive, as if the base was waiting for something to return. "We need to get inside," Ben continued, standing up and pulling out a crowbar from his backpack. "This place may be our only shot at survival. If there's anyone left, we need to find them." Sam, who had been quietly scanning the area, spoke up, his voice tight with uncertainty. "And if there's no one? What then?" "We'll find supplies," Ben said, his voice hardening. "We'll survive." Without another word, Ben shoved the crowbar into the gap in the fence and pried it open. The gate creaked and groaned as the metal strained under the pressure, but with a final snap, it gave way. The sound echoed through the base, the noise cutting through the silence like a knife. Emma flinched at the noise, her eyes darting around. "Quiet," she whispered urgently. "We don't know what's inside." The group moved quickly, slipping through the broken gate and into the compound. The air felt colder here, a biting chill that seemed to seep into their bones. They kept close, their footsteps muffled by the dust and debris that covered the ground. The buildings loomed around them, towering above like sentinels, their broken windows staring down at them like empty eyes. Ben led the way, his eyes scanning the darkened buildings, trying to make sense of their surroundings. There were signs of activity, footprints in the dust, discarded scraps of food, and signs that someone, or something, had been here recently. "Stay alert," Ben ordered, his voice low. "Don't let your guard down." The group moved cautiously, creeping past the decaying buildings. Every window they passed felt like an invitation for the unknown to reach out and grab them. The silence was overwhelming, the kind of silence that made every noise seem like an alarm. Emma's mind raced, her thoughts a jumble of fear, hope, and uncertainty. What if we're the last ones? Clara's voice broke through the silence, filled with fear. What if we're just alone? "We're not alone," Emma replied firmly, though doubt gnawed at her. "There has to be someone." As they moved deeper into the base, they came across a small, dilapidated building at the far end of the compound. The walls were cracked, and the roof had caved in on one side, but it was the most intact structure they had seen so far. Emma's heart skipped a beat. There was a chance, however slim, that someone might be inside. "We check this one," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay quiet." They approached the building slowly, their bodies tensed, every sense alert. Ben reached for the door, which was hanging off its hinges, and carefully pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, and for a moment, Emma thought she heard a noise inside, a faint shuffle of feet, followed by a low, guttural growl. The sound sent a chill through Emma's spine. She froze, her heart racing. Ben motioned for them to stay back and stepped inside first, his rifle raised and ready. Emma and the others followed, their weapons at the ready, prepared for whatever they might find. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single, flickering light bulb. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Broken furniture lay scattered around the room, and papers were strewn across the floor. At first, Emma saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, she noticed movement in the far corner of the room. A figure, hunched over, its back to them. It was hard to make out the details in the dim light, but the shape was unmistakable. It was a person, or at least, it had been. The figure turned slowly, and Emma's stomach twisted as she saw the pale, gaunt face. Its eyes were glazed over, completely vacant. The person had been turned into a zombie. But there was something different about this one. It didn't seem to move with the usual stagger of the undead. Instead, it seemed almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting for them. Before Emma could react, the figure lurched toward them with surprising speed. Ben raised his rifle and fired, but the shot missed, grazing the zombie's shoulder. The creature let out an ear-splitting screech, its mouth opening wide to reveal rotting teeth. "Get back!" Ben shouted, but it was too late. The zombie charged. Emma's heart slammed in her chest as she pulled her knife from its sheath and lunged forward. The fight for survival had only just begun. Part 5, The Desperate Struggle. The zombie lunged with terrifying speed, its decayed limbs reaching out, jaws snapping in the air. Emma barely had time to react, but her instincts kicked in, and she dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp. The floor beneath her was slick with dust and grime, and she slid across it, her heart hammering in her chest. Ben's shot had only grazed the creature, and now it was fully focused on them. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Emma could hear the creature's ragged, labored breaths as it twisted its neck to face her. Its eyes were void of life, yet there was something haunting in the way it hunted them, an unsettling sense of intelligence that wasn't typical of most zombies. "Move!" Ben yelled, trying to get a clear shot again, but the cramped space made it difficult. His rifle jammed slightly, the bullet casing catching on the edge of the chamber. The zombie let out another guttural moan, drawing closer. Emma scrambled to her feet, her heart racing, and saw Clara and Sam positioned near the door, weapons ready but unsure how to help. This wasn't the time for hesitation. They had to act fast, or they would all be overrun. With a burst of adrenaline, Emma grabbed a metal pipe from the floor beside her and swung it toward the zombie's head. The pipe connected with a sickening thud, and for a moment, the creature's head snapped back, its limbs jerking as if stunned. The blow wasn't enough to kill it, but it gave Emma the opening she needed. Ben, now free of his jammed weapon, quickly aimed his rifle and fired, this time hitting the zombie square in the chest. The shot didn't kill it, but it sent the creature staggering backward, its limbs flailing wildly as it lost its balance. "Sam! Clara, now!" Ben ordered urgently. Without missing a beat, Clara ran forward, wielding a crowbar. She swung it with all her strength, connecting with the zombie's skull. The impact sent a crack through its face, and the creature let out a horrifying shriek before collapsing to the floor. For a few seconds, the room was eerily silent, save for their ragged breaths and the soft groaning of the zombie's body. It didn't move, and it didn't rise again. Emma let out a long, shaky breath, her hands still trembling from the sudden rush of fear. "That was too close," Sam said, his voice quiet as he wiped his brow, clearly shaken. "What the hell was that thing?" Emma couldn't answer. Her mind was racing. The zombie had been different, more dangerous than the usual mindless ones they'd seen before. There was something unsettling about it, its speed, its focus, and the fact that it had seemed to wait for them. Ben moved cautiously toward the creature's body, nudging it with the tip of his rifle to make sure it wasn't going to spring back to life. He nodded in satisfaction when it didn't move, then turned to the group. "We're not alone here," he said grimly. "There's something off about this place." Clara's face paled. "What do you mean?" "That thing wasn't like the others." "I know," Ben said, looking around the room as if trying to make sense of their surroundings. "It wasn't just a zombie. It was strategic. We need to be careful. This place is more dangerous than I thought." Emma nodded, her own suspicion growing. She had sensed it too, the way the zombie had waited, the almost calculated nature of its attack. It wasn't a coincidence. "Let's move," Ben said, already heading toward the door. "We need to find a secure place and get some rest. This whole base could be crawling with things like that." The group filed out of the room, stepping into the long corridor of the building. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and the air was thick with dust, but there was something more menacing about the place now. Every creak of the building, every distant sound, made Emma jump, her senses on high alert. They made their way through the hallways, searching for a secure place to hold up for the night. The place seemed larger than it had appeared from the outside, and every turn brought them deeper into the labyrinth of rooms and corridors. As they moved further in, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. Eventually, they found a small, windowless room at the end of a corridor. It was dimly lit and filled with old, broken furniture, but it was as secure as they were going to get for now. "We'll take turns standing guard," Ben said, his voice sharp. "Everyone get some rest, but keep your weapons ready." Emma sat down against the wall, her body aching from the tension of the fight. She glanced over at Clara, who was already sitting by the door, her eyes darting around, still on edge. "Are you okay?" Emma asked softly. Clara nodded but didn't speak. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Emma could tell that the encounter with the zombie had rattled her, even more than it had rattled the rest of them. "We'll make it through this," Emma said quietly, trying to reassure her, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "We just need to keep going. We have to find out what's happening here." Clara gave her a small, uncertain smile, and Emma returned the gesture, though it didn't feel as comforting as she had hoped. They were so close to finding answers, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it seemed to become. Something wasn't right at this base, and Emma had a sinking feeling that they had just scratched the surface. The night passed in uneasy silence, with only the occasional shift of someone standing watch or the distant sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the building. Emma tried to sleep, but her mind kept racing. They had entered a place full of secrets, secrets that could be the key to their survival, or their undoing. When morning finally came, it brought no comfort, only more questions. "We move out at dawn," Ben said. "We find answers today." The morning light crept through the cracks in the building, casting a muted glow across the room. Emma stretched her stiff limbs, the exhaustion of the past days weighing heavily on her. The night had been long and full of eerie noises, strange, unsettling sounds echoing from deep within the compound. Emma had tried to dismiss it as the building settling or the wind, but a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. Ben was already up and gathering his gear, his face set in a grim expression. Clara and Sam were awake too, though neither of them spoke much. Everyone knew the weight of what was ahead. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about uncovering the truth of what had happened here, and, Emma feared, what might still be waiting for them. "Everyone ready?" Ben's voice was low but firm. They nodded, though there was a shared hesitance among them. None of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched. Emma had been on edge ever since that first encounter with the strange zombie, and the more they moved through the abandoned base, the more she wondered if something far more dangerous was lurking in the shadows. As they made their way down the dim corridors, Emma's eyes were drawn to the signs of abandonment, the cracked floors, the rusted doors, the peeling paint. It was all so silent, so still. But there was something else too, a sense that the base had been hastily abandoned, that whoever had once occupied it had left in a hurry. They arrived at a large room, its double doors still intact but covered in grime and dust. Emma's pulse quickened as they approached. There was something important inside, she could feel it. Ben took the lead again, cautiously pushing open one of the doors. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the rest of the base, clean, organized, as if untouched by the chaos that had consumed the world outside. In the center of the room was a large metal table, scattered with papers, files, and equipment. The walls were lined with monitors, all displaying static or blank screens, their wires hanging loosely. "This doesn't look like the rest of the base," Sam muttered, stepping forward cautiously. "It's a command center," Ben said, his eyes scanning the room. Whoever was here was in charge of something. Emma walked over to the table and began sifting through the scattered papers. Most of them were technical reports, instructions, and diagrams, all too complex for her to understand at first glance. But one document caught her eye. It was a file marked in bold letters, Project Rebirth. Her heart skipped a beat. Emma pulled the file closer, her hands trembling as she opened it. The contents were chilling. The first page contained a list of names, scientists, military personnel, and doctors, all involved in some sort of research. But the second page contained the real revelation. It detailed a virus, one that was intended to enhance human capabilities. A virus engineered to make humans stronger, faster, immune to disease. But something had gone horribly wrong. The document explained how the virus had mutated, turning its test subjects into mindless, bloodthirsty creatures. Worse, the virus had spread far beyond the initial tests, infecting entire populations, causing global panic. This is it," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. "This is how it all started." Ben stepped up behind her, reading over her shoulder. His face darkened as he processed the information. "Project Rebirth," he muttered. "They were trying to create super soldiers. But they unleashed hell instead." "Is this why the military abandoned the base?" Clara asked, her voice laced with fear. "Did they fail? Did they make it worse? Does it even matter?" Sam said quietly, his face pale. "Look at us. We're living in the aftermath of whatever they did." Emma's mind raced. They had found the truth, but it wasn't the kind of truth that brought comfort. Project Rebirth was the catalyst for the nightmare they now found themselves trapped in. And it was clear that the people behind it had no idea what they had unleashed. "We need to find the source," Emma said, her voice firm now, the adrenaline of discovery fueling her. "We need to find out where this virus came from and whether there's anything left that can stop it." "Yeah, and what do we do with all this?" Ben gestured to the papers. Do we leave it here? Let it get lost to time? We take it with us, Emma said decisively. This could be the key to figuring out how to survive, how to stop this. Ben nodded, looking at the papers with a renewed sense of urgency. We'll gather what we can. But we don't know how much time we have. There could be more of those things out there. Emma felt a chill at the thought of more mutated zombies. The ones they had already encountered were terrifying enough, but if there were more of them, more like the one they had found last night, then they were in more danger than they realized. Clara swallowed hard. What if they're not the only thing we need to worry about? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Ben snapped out of his thoughts. Let's move. We've got what we came for. Now, let's get out of here before we run into any more surprises. They began collecting the papers, stuffing them into bags and backpacks. Emma grabbed everything she could, her mind still reeling from the enormity of what they had uncovered. They had only scratched the surface of a much darker, more twisted secret. The group made their way back through the corridors, retracing their steps. The weight of the information they had found felt heavy in their chests, and the ominous silence of the base only seemed to grow louder with each passing minute. But as they approached the exit, something shifted in the air, a presence, something that wasn't there before. Emma's pulse spiked again. They weren't alone. Ben stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing. Stay close. We've got company. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed down the hall. And then, the unmistakable groan of the undead filled the air. The group braced for what was coming. They hadn't even left yet, and already, the base was closing in around them. We don't have much time, Ben said, his voice tight with urgency. Get ready. The fight was far from over. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before them, and as the echo of shuffling feet grew louder, Emma's heart raced. The air was thick with tension, and the dread she'd felt earlier in the day now clawed at her chest. They had uncovered the truth behind the outbreak, but it felt like the more they learned, the deeper they were falling into a nightmare that had no escape. Ben motioned for the group to move quickly, his hand gripping his rifle tightly as he scanned the darkness ahead. The footsteps were drawing nearer, and Emma could hear the low, guttural groans that sent a chill down her spine. It wasn't just one or two zombies, they were surrounded. Stay close, Ben muttered, his eyes flicking toward the exits. We need to move fast. Sam, Clara, and Emma moved in unison, staying close together. Their breaths were shallow, their footsteps barely making a sound as they slipped down the hall. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting erratic shadows that seemed to warp and twist in the corner of Emma's vision. The group rounded a corner, only to find the hallway blocked by a horde of undead. They stumbled, dragging their feet, their eyes vacant, and their bodies contorted into grotesque, unnatural shapes. Emma's stomach twisted in horror as she realized the creatures before them weren't just the usual mindless walkers, they were fast, relentless, and seemed to know exactly where to find them. This way! Ben shouted, pulling them down a side corridor that led deeper into the base. They dashed down the narrow passageway, the sound of their footsteps echoing through the concrete walls. Emma could hear the zombies closing in, their guttural growls growing louder. She glanced behind her, but all she could see was darkness and the flickering light of the hallway they had just fled. Her mind raced with questions. How had they found them so quickly? Had the base been infiltrated? Or was something else at play here? We need to get to the exit, Ben said, his voice strained. If we don't, we're trapped in here. Emma's legs were starting to burn with exhaustion, but she pushed on, determined not to stop. They couldn't afford to slow down, not when they were this close. They had found the truth, they had the files, but it felt like it was all slipping away, like the world was crumbling around them. Ahead, they saw a door, slightly ajar. It led to the exterior, Emma was sure of it. They were close, too close to give up now. But as they reached the door, a horrible realization hit her. There was no way out. The door led into a courtyard, but it was completely surrounded by high, chain-link fences. A trap. Ben, no! Clara cried out, stopping dead in her tracks. Ben slammed into the door, trying to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. The zombies were closing in, and now they were trapped in a concrete cage. A moment of panic spread through the group. "There's no time," Sam yelled, pulling Ben away from the door. "We can't stay here. It's over." "No," Ben said firmly, shaking his head. "This isn't how it ends. Not after everything we've been through. We're getting out of here." Emma stood frozen for a moment, her thoughts scattered, her body trembling. It was like she had been hit by a wave of despair, a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. They were going to die here, weren't they? But then something snapped inside her. No. She wasn't going to let it end like this. Emma's eyes scanned the area frantically, searching for anything that could help. There were crates of old supplies scattered around the courtyard, and her gaze landed on something that made her heart race, a rusted, heavy metal door on the far side of the yard, partially hidden behind a pile of debris. "We can use that." Emma pointed toward it. "There's a way out over there." Ben looked in the direction she was pointing, and for a moment, his face was unreadable. Then, his eyes sharpened with renewed determination. "Let's go," he barked. Without waiting for another word, the group sprinted toward the door. Behind them, the zombies were closing in, their movements jerky and erratic, but their speed was terrifying. They were gaining ground, and the closer they got, the more Emma could feel the panic rising inside her. Sam reached the door first and shoved it open with all his strength. It creaked loudly, and Emma winced at the sound, knowing the zombies would hear it. But it was their only chance. One by one, they poured through the door, just as the first zombie lunged toward them. Emma barely made it through before the creature's outstretched arm grazed her leg. Ben slammed the door shut behind them, and for a moment, there was silence. The only sounds were their ragged breaths as they leaned against the walls, hearts pounding in their chests. "We've got to keep moving," Ben said through gritted teeth, his face pale with adrenaline. "There's no time to stop." The group began to move again, each of them aware that they had only seconds before the horde found another way through. Emma glanced over at Clara, who was breathing heavily but nodding in agreement. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. They were still deep in the heart of the base, and though they had found an exit, it was only a temporary reprieve. There was still so much more to uncover, and the horrors of the past days were just beginning to show their true face. As they sprinted through the open courtyard, Emma's mind raced. There was so much they didn't know, so many questions left unanswered. But there was one thing that was becoming increasingly clear: whatever had happened in this place, whatever had started with Project Rebirth, was far from over. The zombies were just the beginning. And if they didn't find a way to stop it, they would be just another footnote in a history consumed by the undead. But for now, they had to survive. They weren't out of danger yet. And with every passing moment, Emma could feel the walls closing in around them. Part 8, The Final Choice. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a dim, orange glow over the barren landscape outside the base. The wind howled, carrying with it the distant moans of the undead, and the feeling of being hunted never left Emma's mind. They had barely escaped the compound, but the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We can't stop," Ben said, his voice sharp, as they trudged across the cracked, abandoned parking lot toward the nearby forest. "We need to find someplace safe, someplace to figure out our next move." Emma glanced over at him. His face was etched with exhaustion, but his eyes were still sharp, calculating. Ben was their leader now, whether they liked it or not. And it was clear that despite everything, he wasn't going to let them fall. "We can't run forever," Clara said, her voice hoarse, and the weight of her words hung in the air. "We need answers. We can't just keep running." Emma understood her frustration. It mirrored her own. Every step they took seemed to lead them further into a labyrinth of chaos. They knew about Project Rebirth now, the twisted experiment that had birthed the nightmare they were living in, but they were no closer to understanding how to stop it. "We'll find the answers," Ben promised, his voice unwavering. "We just need time." As they moved deeper into the forest, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The dense trees created an impenetrable canopy, but she still felt exposed, vulnerable. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the files they had found. Project Rebirth was only part of the story. There was more, much more that they hadn't uncovered yet. What if the base wasn't the only one? What if this was happening everywhere? The group found a small, dilapidated cabin hidden between the trees. It was barely standing, the roof sagging and the windows cracked, but it would provide some shelter for the night. Ben led the way inside, scanning the area before giving the all-clear. "We'll rest here for now," he said, his voice soft but tired. "But we can't stay long." Sam, who had been quieter than usual, sank into a corner and wrapped his arms around his knees. His eyes were distant, lost in thought. Emma could see the toll the journey was taking on him. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion, it was the psychological weight, the constant fear, the never-ending question of whether they would make it out alive. Emma moved toward the small window and peered out, watching the eerie stillness of the woods. There were no signs of movement. No zombies in sight. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world was quiet. "We need a plan," Clara spoke up, breaking the silence. "We can't keep running forever. We need to find out where this all started, where Project Rebirth came from. There has to be more information. A place we can go to stop it." Ben nodded, though his face was grim. "There's one more place. A research facility deep in the mountains. If anyone has answers, it's there. But getting there won't be easy." Emma's mind raced. Another place? Another journey? She glanced at the group. Ben was right, they couldn't stop. They had to keep going, no matter the cost. If there was even a chance that this research facility held the answers they needed, they couldn't afford to ignore it. "What's the plan?" Sam asked, his voice quiet but determined. "How do we get there?" "We move at first light," Ben replied. "It's a 2-day hike, and we'll need to be cautious. There's no telling what's waiting for us out there." Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. The last time they'd had any sense of safety, it had been taken from them in an instant. But there was no choice. They had to push forward. Clara stood and began to gather their supplies, her movements sharp and deliberate. "We have to prepare for the worst. It won't just be zombies we're up against. Whoever's behind this mess won't just let us waltz in and take their secrets." Ben gave her a quick nod of agreement. "Right. We'll need weapons, supplies, everything we can carry. We leave nothing behind." The night passed in an uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of distant groans and the occasional rustle in the trees. Emma couldn't sleep. Her mind kept turning over the events of the past few days, the horrifying truth they had uncovered, and the realization that this nightmare was far from over. As dawn broke, the group gathered their things, preparing for what would undoubtedly be their most dangerous journey yet. Ben led the way, with Emma, Clara, and Sam following close behind. The path ahead was uncertain, the danger ever present, but there was no turning back. Emma glanced back one last time at the cabin they'd briefly called home. It was the last bit of safety they'd known, but she knew they couldn't stay there forever. The world outside was broken, twisted, and filled with horrors beyond their comprehension. But if there was a chance, just a chance, that they could find a way to end it all, to stop the plague of the undead and put an end to Project Rebirth, they had to take it. Their journey into the unknown had only just begun. And Emma, for all the fear that gripped her heart, knew that this was the only way forward. The final choice had been made. Now, all they had to do was survive long enough to make it count. They moved into the woods, each step echoing with the weight of their decision. The world was full of unknowns, but one thing was certain, their fight wasn't over. Not yet. And Emma was ready to face whatever came next. For hope. For survival. For the future.